Hi everyone, and welcome to this video on African American civil rights in the USA. In this video we're going to be looking at civil rights during the period known as Reconstruction, which was 1865 to 1877. So 1865 marked the end of the American Civil War, and this also marked the beginning of Reconstruction. It's called Reconstruction because they had to physically rebuild the whole of the South because it had been pretty much destroyed during the war. But also they're about reconstructing the relationship between the North and South of America and also the white population and African American population. So the 13th Amendment of 1865 abolished slavery. However, practices such as convict leasing and the Black Codes allowed slavery to be restored in America in all but name. So convict leasing was this practice that prisoners could be leased out to employers and would do forced labour without any pay. Now, since African Americans were disproportionately in prison due to the Black Codes, this meant that many black people were back in slavery, except this time it was by prison. Black Codes were a set of laws mostly in the South where pretty much doing anything in your daily life would mean that you would be arrested simply because you were an African American. The 1866 Civil Rights Act said that theoretically everybody in America was equal. This act was vetoed by President Johnson, so he tried to stop it, but Congress overrode his veto and they pushed it through to be passed. Then the 1868 14th Amendment made the 66 Civil Rights Act part of the Constitution so that it couldn't be vetoed or reversed, at least easily. In the same year, Congress tried to impeach President Johnson, and this was the first time that Congress had ever tried to impeach a president. The 1870 15th Amendment made it illegal to deny the right to vote to African Americans on openly racial grounds. However, many loopholes were developed, particularly in the South, to continue to disenfranchise African Americans. There would be poll taxes where you'd have to pay to vote, literacy tests where they would ask random, really difficult questions that, since they were mostly uneducated, African Americans wouldn't be able to answer, and also things like the grandfather clause, which would state that you'd have to prove that your grandfather had been born in America in order to vote, and of course, since many African Americans were brought there by slavery, they could not do that, so they could not vote. The 1875 Civil Rights Act pushed for equal access to public facilities, but by 1883 most of the act had been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, so it was very diluted and didn't really do much. After 1875, no more civil rights acts were passed until 1957. The Freedmen Bureau, established in 1865, served to help integrate former slaves into American life. This meant providing housing, employment, education, food, and medical care. However, its impact was short-lived as it lost federal funding and was closed in 1872. Also, in 1870, so 5 years after it had been established, 90% of African American children still could not read or write, whereas only 15% of white children couldn't read or write. Additionally, an immediate response to the abolishment of slavery was the formation of the Ku Klux Klan in 1865. Their aims were to restore white supremacy, destroy the Republican Party, as at that point in time the Republicans were for civil rights. They wanted to undermine Reconstruction and re-establish a black labour force. Their violent methods included assassinations, killings, intimidation, and burning black churches, schools, and homes. They were supposedly disbanded after the Civil Rights Act in 1871, however, they were supported by the mainstream Southern white society, and the leaders of the KKK were the natural leaders of Southern society, like businessmen and landowners, so their influence never really went away. The Compromise of 1877 marked the ending of Reconstruction. This was where the Democrats agreed to recognize the Republican President Hayes in return for the complete withdrawal of federal troops from the South. This meant that there would no longer be any sort of federal presence in the South, and these federal troops were the only protection for African Americans, as they were there to make sure that the civil rights legislation was enforced. But since they were removed, this meant that the North lost interest in enforcing civil rights in the South. So overall, it's clear that during Reconstruction, Congress was the driving force behind African American civil rights. They were actively against President Johnson, and they pushed for the civil rights legislation. The presidency was mixed, as Andrew Johnson was openly racist and supported slavery, whereas President Grant, who came after Johnson, passed civil rights legislation and tried to suppress the KKK. The Supreme Court was the most hostile, as they consistently undermined civil rights. The 1873 Slaughterhouse Case enforced state power rather than federal power, which meant that it would be up to individual states to give civil rights rather than the federal government. Also, by ruling most of the 1875 Civil Rights Act to be unconstitutional, they diluted the power and influence it could have. Finally, just a quick explanation about two really important terms for the civil rights cause: de facto and de jure. De facto means in fact, and de jure means in law. So you would say that the 15th Amendment had a de facto impact if it actually allowed black people to vote, whereas the 15th Amendment could also have a de jure impact as it gave the theoretical legal right to vote. So it's whether it had an actual impact or just a legal impact.